Every marriage keeps a ledger nobody talks about. The missed calls, the empty chairs at dinner, the small debts quietly piling up in the dark. Sebastian Hayes believed his silence was protection. Then a manila envelope arrived with 11 photographs, built to destroy exactly the man he swore he'd never become, while an uncle smiled from the head of the family table, already 3 moves into a plan that would end in blood on a Brooklyn dock. The photographs were never really about the woman in the emerald dress. They were about a debt someone had finally decided to collect. So who was truly being punished that night, and what would one husband risk to pay it back? Come sit with us for a while. This one's about Sebastian Hayes, a man who could read a hostile boardroom in seconds, but never once managed to read the loneliness sitting across his own dinner table. If you've ever loved someone the wrong way for far too long before finally getting it right, tell us about it in the comments below. The bass at Amara, the rooftop club on West 27th, was loud enough to rearrange a man's heartbeat. Dorian Vance had inherited 3 hotels, a shipping company, and absolutely no impulse control, and he was currently proving the last part by doing tequila shots off a stranger's collarbone, while his father's lawyers blew up his phone about a merger he had no intention of reading. "Dorian, baby, careful," someone said, a hand closing around his wrist. He didn't hear the rest. The world had gone soft and gold at the edges, champagne bright, and he was laughing at something that wasn't even funny. And then his heel caught the lip of the rooftop stairs, and there was a half-second where his stomach dropped out from under him like a rug pulled by an unseen hand. He remembers thinking, with total, ridiculous clarity, "I never called my mother back." Then, nothing, a long, black, dreamless nothing, the kind that doesn't announce itself as an ending, because endings are supposed to hurt, and this didn't hurt at all. When feeling came back, it came back wrong. His body was too light. His hands, when he lifted them in front of his face, were narrower, the knuckles unfamiliar, a thin white scar across one that he didn't remember earning. A baby was crying somewhere close, a small, furious sound, and someone was calling a name that wasn't his. "Elliot? Elliot, he needs changing, can you? Elliot?" The word arrived with a whole life stapled to it, someone else's memories pouring in behind his eyes like water finding the cracks in a dam. A bakery on a quiet Brooklyn corner that smelled of butter and burnt sugar. A wedding he didn't remember agreeing to 3 years deep. A husband with a jaw like a closed door and a voice that could go from ice to devastating in the space of one sentence. A son 6 months old, with his husband's dark eyes and absolutely nobody's patience. A husband named Sebastian Hayes, heir to the largest Irish-Italian syndicate on the eastern seaboard. Dorian Vance, a man who had never in his life woken up early, never worked a job, never once in 28 years said "I'm sorry," and meant it, opened his eyes in a stranger's body, in a stranger's marriage, with a stranger's baby crying 2 feet away, and thought, with the particular hysteria of a man who has just realized the universe has a sense of humor. Well, this is new. New York City, present day. The bakery was called Sweet Haven, tucked between a laundromat and a bodega on a tree-lined block in Park Slope, and it had been Elliot Parker's the day he married into the Hayes name, a wedding gift from a mother-in-law who had wanted her son's husband to have something that's just yours, sweetheart, which, in retrospect, Elliot understood now to have been the closest thing to an apology the Hayes family knew how to give. 3 days ago, a manila envelope had arrived at the bakery with no return address. Inside it, 11 photographs. Sebastian Hayes in a black suit at the rooftop bar of the Carlyle, leaning close to a stunning dark-haired woman in an emerald dress, Sebastian's hand at the small of her back, Sebastian's mouth near her ear. Elliot who, 6 months into inhabiting this life, had stopped flinching every time he caught his own unfamiliar reflection, and started genuinely, helplessly caring about the infant currently gumming his own fist on the kitchen floor, and about the cold, watchful, infuriatingly handsome man who was supposed to be that infant's other father had looked at those photographs for 11 straight minutes without breathing. Then he had packed a bag, taken his son, and left. That had been 3 days ago. Sebastian had been standing outside the bakery every morning since. Elliot saw him now from the upstairs window 6:04 a.m., the light still bruised and gray over Brooklyn, a man in a charcoal wool coat standing across Union Street with his hands in his pockets like he had grown there, like the sidewalk had simply decided to keep him. New character for those just walking in, Sebastian Hayes, 31. Heir apparent to the Hayes organization, 3 generations of shipping, real estate, and things far less legal laundered through both. 6'2" of quiet, controlled violence, wearing a $5,000 coat. The kind of man whose silences had a weight you could set a table by. Married to Elliot for 3 years. Father to Milo, currently the world's most expensive, best-dressed man, standing outside a bakery in the cold, refusing to leave. Elliot went downstairs. He did not put on a nicer sweater first, which he would later consider a moral victory. He opened the front door. "How long have you been there?" Sebastian turned. Up close, the 2 days showed the shadow under his eyes, the stubble he never let get this far. "Since you left." That's not an answer, that's a threat. It's the truth. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I've been standing here since the day they took Milo out of my sight for 72 hours, Elliot. I don't know how else to say that without it sounding like something out of a movie." "You could say it inside," said a new voice, dry as good gin. "Preferably before Mrs. Okafor next door starts a group chat about the Mafia stakeout on Union Street." New character, Benicho 34. Elliot's best friend since the two of them bonded over burnt croissants 3 years ago. Co-owner of Sweet Haven in every way that mattered except the deed. Short, unbothered, wears an apron like armor, and has exactly 0 patience for rich men who make his best friend cry into proofing dough. Benny held the door wider, gave Sebastian a long, unimpressed once-over, and disappeared upstairs with Milo balanced on one hip before Elliot could argue, which left Elliot and Sebastian sitting across from each other at the small kitchen table, coffee going cold between them. The silence stretched thin and strange, not the empty silence of the penthouse, but something fuller, something neither of them knew how to pick up yet. "She was a business arrangement," Sebastian said finally, not looking away. "Camille Whitfield. Her father wants a shipping contract my uncle wants signed." My uncle set the meeting without telling me what it actually was, until I was already sitting across from her. "You went quiet for 2 days when I asked you about it, because I already knew you wouldn't believe the truth, so what was the point of saying it fast?" His voice dropped, rough at the edges. "Elliot, someone inside my own family wants to use you and Milo as leverage against me. You're not safe in any room I'm not in. And I need you to hear that not as your husband, as the only person on earth who actually understands how dangerous these people are." Elliot wrapped both hands around his mug, mostly so Sebastian wouldn't see them shake. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that still occasionally sounded like Dorian Vance, a voice muttered, "He's telling the truth, idiot. Look at his hands." Sebastian's hands, folded on the table, had gone white-knuckled around nothing at all. "They're not leaving Brooklyn," Sebastian said. "Not after the man who followed you to the pharmacy on Tuesday." Elliot's stomach dropped. There was a man. I had him removed before he got within a block of you. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to spend 3 days looking over your shoulder at every stranger on your own street." He exhaled. "I'm telling you now because you deserve to know exactly what you walked into when you left the penthouse. Stay here today, both of you. I need 1 more night to move my people into position." For once in the last 3 days, Elliot listened. Later, lying awake in the dark with Milo's monitor hissing static on the nightstand, Elliot let himself do the thing he usually didn't allow think backward, all the way to the beginning of this borrowed life, before the photographs, before any of it. He remembered the first morning clearly, if unevenly, the way you remember a fever. Waking in a penthouse the size of his old family's entire Hamptons house, sunlight coming in wrong through unfamiliar windows, and Sebastian Hayes standing in the doorway of the nursery in a suit already pressed for a 7 a.m. meeting, looking at him at Elliot with an expression so guarded it might as well have been a locked door. "You seem different today," Sebastian had said. "Not suspicious, exactly. Just careful, the way a man is careful around something he's already been burned by once. If only you knew," Elliot had thought and said instead, "didn't sleep well," which was, if nothing else, extremely true. It had taken him 3 weeks to stop flinching at his own reflection in the elevator mirrors. It had taken him 5 to learn that Sebastian took his coffee black except on Sundays, when for reasons he never explained, and Elliot never asked about, because some mysteries were better left as small offerings he took it with too much cream, like a man allowing himself exactly 1 softness a week. It had taken him 2 months to notice that Sebastian Hayes, terror of 3 boroughs, closer of deals that made grown men sweat through their shirts, could not, under any circumstances, successfully swaddle an infant. Elliot had walked into the nursery one Tuesday night to find him standing over the crib with Milo half wrapped in a blanket like a very small, very unimpressed burrito, muttering instructions to himself from a parenting app propped against a stuffed giraffe. "You're doing it upside down," Elliot had said, biting back a laugh. "I am doing it correctly." Sebastian hadn't looked up. "The app says." "The app is not watching you do it wrong in real time. Move." Elliot had nudged him aside gently and rewrapped Milo in 4 efficient motions his hands somehow already knew, muscle memory from a body that had done this before even if the mind driving it hadn't. When he looked up, Sebastian was watching him with an expression. Elliot didn't have a name for yet something unguarded, something that looked almost like relief. "You're good at that," Sebastian had said quietly. "I had a good teacher," Elliot had answered, which wasn't a lie. Exactly. Elliot's hands had learned it. Elliot's memory just hadn't been there for the lessons. That had been the beginning of something not quite friendship, not quite anything either of them was willing to name out loud, but a kind of détente, small kindnesses traded across the wreckage of a marriage neither of them fully understood. Sebastian started coming home for dinner 2 nights a week instead of 0. Elliot stopped bracing for the sound of the front door like it might be bad news. There had even, God help him, been moments of something dangerously close to flirting. "You've been staring," Sebastian had said one night in March, over a dinner Elliot had actually cooked instead of ordered, watching Elliot watch him across the table with an eyebrow raised in open challenge. "I'm allowed to look at my own husband. You usually look at me like I'm a math problem you're trying to solve. That's because you are a math problem." Extremely poorly labeled variables. Elliot had propped his chin on his hand, unable to help the small, teasing smile that came with it, a smile that belonged more to Dorian Vance than to careful, wounded Elliot Parker, and that was precisely the point. For instance, nobody warns you that the terrifying head of a criminal shipping empire also alphabetizes his spice rack. It's efficient, it's deranged, Sebastian. You have 3 different jars of paprika arranged by heat level. You've been going through my spice rack. I've been cooking, which you would know if you were home before 9 more than one night out of 7. It had come out sharper than intended, an old wound catching on new stitches, and Elliot had watched something flicker and dim behind Sebastian's eyes, not anger, just a kind of tired acknowledgement, a man recognizing a debt he already knew he owed and hadn't yet found a way to pay. "I know," Sebastian had said, quiet. "I'm trying." "I know you are," Elliot had said back, surprising himself with how much he meant it, and for a moment one single suspended moment across a kitchen table that smelled like garlic and rosemary and the particular warmth of a house that was slowly starting to feel like a home it had felt like maybe this life, this borrowed marriage he'd fallen backward into, might actually turn into something real. Then the manila envelope had arrived, and all of it had gone up like dry paper catching flame. Lying in the dark now, 3 days and 1 alley fight later, Elliot pressed his palm flat against his own sternum, as if he could hold the ache there in place, by force, and thought, "I want it to be true. God help me. I want the spice rack and the Sunday cream in his coffee and the terrible swaddling to be true." He just didn't know yet if wanting it was going to be enough. By 9 that night, Milo would not stop crying. The apartment above the bakery had shrunk to the size of a shoebox, and Elliot, a man who, in his previous life, had once bought a private plane on a dare and never once flown it, discovered that nothing on earth was as claustrophobic as being told to stay inside for your own good. 10 minutes, he told Benny, who was bouncing Milo against his shoulder with the weary competence of a man who had done this at 3 a.m. more than once this week. Just 10 minutes of air. He didn't tell Sebastian. He would regret that within 4 minutes flat, the exact amount of time it took Sebastian to appear beside him on the narrow street behind the bakery, coat collar up, saying nothing, just falling into step at his shoulder, like gravity had rearranged itself around the two of them. "You didn't have to follow me. I always have to follow you," Sebastian said, and there was something almost like humor in it, dark and dry. "It's become a personality trait. You have a lot of personality traits for a man who used to communicate exclusively through one-word texts. I'm expanding my range. Slowly." "Glacially," Sebastian agreed, and Elliot huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh but wanted to be, surprised at how easily it still came, even now, even furious and frightened and 3 days deep into the worst week of 2 separate lives. The street behind the bakery ran narrow and quiet toward the water, brownstones giving way to old brick warehouses that had been converted into lofts nobody could afford, the kind of Brooklyn block that still smelled faintly of a harbor even blocks from any actual water. The air had that particular October bite to it, salt and cold, and the ghost of somebody's fireplace 2 houses down, and overhead the street lights buzzed the low orange of sodium bulbs that made everything look a little like a photograph already, a little like something being remembered even as it happened. "You're doing the thing," Sebastian said. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet, and I can hear you thinking so loud I could probably read it off you like a stock ticker." "I was thinking that this is the first 10 minutes we've spent alone together in 5 days that didn't involve either a hospital or a threat assessment." Sebastian's mouth curved, just slightly, in the dark. "Should I be offended you find that notable? I find it suspicious. Nothing good happens to us during unsupervised alone time. Statistically, we should turn back." Statistically, Sebastian agreed, and didn't turn back, and neither did Elliot, and for 30 seconds Elliot counted them later. The way you count things, after they've become important, it almost felt normal. 2 men walking toward the water at the end of the block, close enough that their sleeves brushed, close enough that Elliot could smell rain and cedar, and something underneath that was just Sebastian, familiar in a way that startled him every single time, because it wasn't his memory that recognized it. It was something that had grown in 6 months, quietly, against his will, and it did not care in the slightest that he had left this man 3 days ago, with a suitcase and a very good reason. Then 4 men came out of the dark at both ends of the alley near the water, and the night stopped being normal at all. Elliot pulled Milo no. Milo was with Benny. Thank God, and instead pulled himself back against the brick, heart slamming, and Sebastian stepped in front of him without a single word, like his body had made the decision before his mind caught up. What happened next lasted 90 seconds. Elliot knew because he counted, the way he'd apparently started doing with all the worst moments of this life, standing flat against cold brick while Sebastian moved through 4 armed men with a kind of terrible, total precision, no wasted motion. No hesitation, something in him gone completely and frighteningly still even as his hands weren't. When it was over, Sebastian turned around breathing hard, knuckles split, and found Elliot's eyes immediately across the dark the way he always did, like his body simply knew where to look. Then his phone rang. He answered it. Elliot watched his face go white. "They know Milo's the direct heir now that my father's stepped back," Sebastian said, voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle can't take control of the family while our son is alive to inherit it first." Elliot opened the bakery door the next afternoon and went cold from the inside out. It was her, the woman from the photographs. Dark hair swept up, elegant even on an ordinary Brooklyn sidewalk in the middle of a Tuesday, wearing not the emerald dress, but a face he'd have known anywhere, because he'd been closing his eyes and seeing it for 3 days straight. "I'm not your enemy," she said before he could speak, "and I'm running out of time to prove it. New character. Camille Whitfield, 29. Daughter of a shipping magnate the Hayes family needed a contract from, and as it turns out considerably smarter and considerably braver than the role she'd been handed in someone else's plan." Elliot let her in because something in her voice told him he needed to. Behind the counter, Benny went very still, one hand drifting toward the rolling pin he kept by the register, with the specific, deniable innocence of a man perfectly prepared to use a baking implement as a weapon if the situation called for it. Elliot waved him off, small and steadying, and led Camille to the small table in the back where the afternoon light came through gauzy curtains and turned everything the color of weak tea. Up close, she didn't look like the woman in the photographs, not because she was any less beautiful, but because the version in the photographs had been arranged, lit, staged for an audience, and the version sitting across from Elliot now looked simply tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has spent 6 weeks carrying a secret that was actively poisoning her from the inside. "I know what those photos looked like," she said before he could ask. "I know exactly what they looked like, because I helped stage them, even if I didn't understand at the time what I was staging. I've replayed that night about 400 times since, trying to find the moment I should have walked out, and there wasn't one, because nobody told me the truth until it was already too late to undo it. Why come here now? Because I found out yesterday what happens next, and I couldn't live with myself if I let it happen without warning you." Her hands were shaking faintly around the teacup. "My father raised me to believe loyalty to a business deal was the same thing as loyalty to a person. It took me 29 years and one very bad 6 weeks to figure out those are not the same thing at all." They sat at the small table with 2 cups of tea neither of them drank, and she talked. She told him her name in full. She told him Sebastian's uncle Marcus Hayes, the family's consigliere, 61, the kind of smile you could cut glass with, had approached her father 6 weeks ago with a business proposal that turned out to be something else entirely. She told him the rooftop meeting had been arranged. The seating had been arranged. The photographer had been arranged. He needed Sebastian broken, she said, not physically, emotionally. A broken man makes mistakes. A man who thinks he's lost his family loses his judgment. And a man without judgment doesn't hold on to leadership of a syndicate for very long. Elliot's hands tightened around the mug. "So you went along with it?" "I didn't understand what it fully was until it was already done." She held his eyes. "I'm sorry for what those photographs did to you. I mean that." She paused, then said the thing she'd clearly come to say. "You should know something about your husband. It's not a secret in that world, everyone around him knows it. Sebastian Hayes loves you in a way that makes him vulnerable. And in that world, vulnerability is a weapon somebody will always try to use against you." Elliot looked at her, throat tight. That night, at the rooftop, he couldn't focus for 5 minutes straight. He kept checking his phone. He was supposed to be closing a deal, and he was somewhere else entirely. One of his own men told me afterward that Sebastian's always been that way, present in every room except the one that actually matters to him. There is a particular kind of grief in being told someone loved you desperately and feeling nothing at all, because you never got to feel it when it actually counted. That was exactly what moved through Elliot now. Sitting at that table 3 years of a marriage he had only just started living, cold dinners eaten alone, calls that rang out, a birthday cake with candles nobody had lit. Maybe Sebastian loved him, maybe that was even true, but love that never showed up on time felt like nothing at all. Camille's phone rang. She answered, and Elliot watched her face change in real time, the color draining out of it, her jaw tightening. She looked at him across the table, voice gone very quiet and very controlled. "We need to find Sebastian, right now." She was already standing. "Marcus has ordered an assassination, not a kidnapping. He wants you and Milo dead before morning." Benny grabbed Milo and the diaper bag off the counter without being asked twice, and the 4 of them moved through Brooklyn streets, gone suddenly unfamiliar with danger. Every parked car a potential threat. Every stranger on the sidewalk a question Elliot couldn't afford to leave unanswered. Camille drove like she'd done it under pressure before, cutting through side streets with a precision that made Elliot wonder, not for the first time, exactly what kind of childhood produced a woman who could stage a rooftop photograph and outrun an assassination order in the same 6 weeks. Milo, sensing something in the air even at 6 months old, had gone quiet and wide-eyed against Benny's chest in the back seat, small fists curled tight around nothing. They found him outside the bakery's side entrance. Camille spotted him first, Sebastian near the alley with 2 of his men, phone at his ear, already moving like his body knew something was coming before his mind confirmed it. Elliot called his name. Sebastian turned, and the look that crossed his face at the sight of Elliot and Milo, held tight against Benny's chest a few feet back, screaming at the cold, was the kind of look a person cannot fake, cannot rehearse, cannot perform for anyone's benefit. Then everything happened at once. The first shot came from the rooftop across the street, a sharp crack tearing the night open, and Sebastian was already moving, closing the distance in 3 strides, turning his body into the space between the gun and Elliot's, before Elliot's brain had even finished processing the sound. The impact spun him sideways. He went down hard against the pavement. Sebastian Elliot dropped to his knees, hands already at the wound, blood hot and shocking under his fingers. Sebastian's hand closed around his wrist, urgent. "Take Milo. Get behind the..." Another shot hit the ground 2 feet away. Elliot didn't think. He reached down, pulled the gun from Sebastian's holster, with hands that had never once fired a weapon in either of his 2 lives, planted his feet, and pointed it at the rooftop. Once. Twice. 3 times. The shooting stopped. He didn't know if he'd hit anyone. He didn't care. He just needed it to stop, and it stopped. and that was the entire measure of success he required that night. Sebastian's men flooded the street within seconds, neutralizing everything left to neutralize. The sound of it distant and underwater in Elliot's ears, drowned out by the much louder fact of blood soaking warm through his own fingers. Elliot dropped back down beside Sebastian, pressed both hands against the wound in his side, and talked he didn't even know what he was saying. Just fragments. Stay with me. Look at me. You don't get to do this. You don't get to leave me with a maybe marriage and a baby and a rice cooker joke. I never finished laughing at nonsense. All of it. But Sebastian's eyes stayed on his the entire time, glassy and unfocused but present, tracking Elliot's face like it was the only fixed point left in a world gone sideways. Milo, Sebastian managed, barely a whisper. He's fine. He's with Camille. He's fine. You're the one who's not fine. So shut up and stay awake. Elliot's voice cracked down the middle. That's an order. I don't care what rank that is in your stupid family. I outrank everyone right now. Something that might have been a laugh, wet and faint, moved through Sebastian's chest under Elliot's hands. Yes, sir, he breathed. And then the ambulance was there, red light strobing off wet brick, and hands that weren't Elliot's were pulling him gently back to make room. And the last thing Elliot saw before they loaded Sebastian into the back of it was his eyes, still open, still finding Elliot's across the widening distance, refusing all the way to the doors to look anywhere else. The hospital in downtown Brooklyn was small and too bright, and smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner. Elliot sat in a plastic chair outside the OR for 4 hours with Milo finally asleep against his chest, and Camille silent beside him and did not cry once. He was somewhere past crying that flat, open place that arrives after everything has already happened, and there's nothing left to brace for. A nurse came by twice with updates that meant nothing to him. Stable, still in surgery. The doctor will be out soon, and each time Elliot nodded like the words made sense, like he was absorbing information instead of just watching the nurse's mouth move. Benny arrived somewhere in hour 2, breathless, flour still dusted along one forearm from where he'd abandoned a batch of morning buns mid-proof, and sat down on Elliot's other side without a word, just close enough that their shoulders touched, which was its own kind of language between them by now. You don't have to say anything, Benny said, eventually, when the silence had stretched past an hour. I'm just going to sit here and be a body next to your body until this is over. That's the whole plan. Thank you, Elliot managed, voice cracking on the second word, and Benny's hand found his on the plastic armrest and stayed there, warm and solid, an anchor in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and felt, for 4 straight hours, like the entire world had shrunk down to the width of one closed door. At some point, Camille brought coffee from a machine down the hall, terrible and lukewarm, and pressed a cup into Elliot's hands like an offering she didn't have the words to make properly. He drank it anyway. It gave his hands something to do besides shake. Sebastian came out of surgery by morning, critical, then stable. Elliot walked into the recovery room, sat beside the bed, and waited. Sebastian's eyes opened 2 hours later and found him immediately. Like even half-conscious, his body simply knew where Elliot was in a room. You stayed, he said, voice rough. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he started talking, and once he started, he didn't seem able to stop every unanswered call, every dinner eaten alone, every night he'd chosen the family's business over the person waiting for him at home. He talked about mistaking silence for strength and distance for protection. His voice broke halfway through, and he kept going anyway. Elliot listened to every word. Then he stood up. He picked up Milo, who stirred and settled against his shoulder with a small, unbothered sigh, the way babies do when they've decided a person is safe. He looked at Sebastian one last time. I believe you love me, he said. I really do. His voice didn't shake, which surprised him. But love doesn't erase 3 years of you letting me eat dinner alone, in a house you never bothered to walk into on time. You love me, and you still let me drown in it. So yes, I believe you. He shifted Milo higher against his shoulder. And I'm still leaving. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists 11 time zones away from your own life. Camille had insisted for Elliot's safety, until Marcus Hayes's people had actually been rounded up, and not just scattered, that Elliot and Milo disappear somewhere. The family's reach didn't extend as cleanly. Somewhere Marcus's remaining loyalists would have to work considerably harder to find. Sebastian, still bandaged, still furious at his own uncle in a way that had gone past anger into something colder, had made exactly one call, and 3 days later Elliot found himself in a rented machiya house, down a narrow lane in the Higashiyama district of Kyoto, wisteria dripping over a stone wall outside the window, Milo blinking up at unfamiliar wooden beams with the placid curiosity only very small children can afford. "It's temporary," Sebastian had said at JFK, standing a careful 2 feet away like he'd learned, finally, to stop closing distances he hadn't been invited to close. 6 weeks, maybe 8, until it's safe. He hadn't asked to come. That, more than anything, was what finally cracked something loose in Elliot's chest, the fact that Sebastian Hayes, a man who apparently solved every problem in his life by simply appearing and refusing to leave, had instead stood at a departure gate and let his husband and son walk away from him a second time, because Elliot had asked for space and Sebastian, for once, had actually given it. He texted, though, every day. Never about anything urgent, a photo of the harbor near his temporary safe house in Providence, where he'd relocated to run the family's cleanup from a distance. A recommendation for a ramen place 2 streets from the machiya that turned out to be extraordinary. A single line, most nights, that said nothing more than good night. Both of you, and somehow undid Elliot a little more each time. It was Benny who had flown out for 2 weeks with an expired passport and a stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural, who finally said it out loud, sitting cross-legged on the tatami with a beer he'd smuggled through customs in his sock. "You're smiling at your phone again. I'm not. You are. You do this face. It's the same face you made over the first croissant you didn't burn." Benny took a long, judgmental sip. "I'm just saying. For a man who left his husband bleeding in a hospital bed with a very righteous speech, you sure do reread his texts a lot. He deserved the speech." "I'm not arguing that." Benny shrugged. "I'm arguing that deserving a speech and being unforgivable are 2 very different men. And you, Elliot Parker, look like a guy who's already halfway to forgiving him and is just waiting to see if he'll do the work to earn the rest." Elliot didn't answer. Outside, the wisteria moved in the evening wind, and somewhere across an ocean, his phone buzzed with a photograph of Sebastian holding up 2 mismatched onesies at a Target in Providence with the caption, "Which one says, 'My other dad has better taste than me.'" Elliot laughed before he could stop himself, the sound startling in the quiet house, and Milo, on the floor beside him, laughed back purely because his father had, which was, Elliot thought, possibly the most devastating thing that had happened to him all week. He didn't tell Elliot he was coming. That, in retrospect, was either the smartest or the most reckless decisions Sebastian Hayes had made in a year of otherwise very carefully considered decisions. But by week 4 of Kyoto, he had discovered a limit to how many nights he could sit alone in a rented Providence condo, staring at a phone screen before something in him simply overrode the plan. He landed at Kansai at 11 at night, took a 2-hour car through dark hills he didn't look at once, and arrived at the machiya's narrow lane a little past 1 in the morning, where he stood outside the gate for exactly as long as it took to lose his nerve twice and find it a 3rd time. Elliot opened the door in an old t-shirt that wasn't his and sweatpants that definitely weren't, hair a wreck, looking for all the world like a man who'd finally gotten Milo down for the night and was 2 minutes from doing the same, and went very, very still. "You didn't call," he said. "I know. You flew 14 hours without calling. I know that too." Sebastian shifted the single duffel bag on his shoulder, suddenly, absurdly nervous in a way 3 years of marriage had never once managed to make him. "I told myself I'd turn back if it felt like the wrong thing to do. It never felt like the wrong thing to do. I think that might be a problem, honestly, given my track record on knowing what's the right thing to do." Elliot didn't laugh, not quite, but something in his face loosened at the corners. "You look terrible. 14 hours, Elliot, I'm just saying. For the head of a criminal empire, you have shockingly bad circulation on long flights." But he stepped back from the door anyway, wide enough for an invitation, and Sebastian took it the way he'd learned, slowly, painfully, to take all of Elliot's invitations these days carefully, like something that might still be revoked. They didn't talk about anything important that first night. Sebastian actually slept, 7 straight hours. The first time in a month his body had allowed it on the low futon in the room across the hall from Elliot's, close enough to hear Milo's occasional fussing through the thin walls, and woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Elliot swearing quietly at a Japanese rice cooker that had apparently developed opinions of its own. "It won't open," Elliot said, without turning around. when Sebastian appeared in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's rumpled shirt. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes. I think it's judging me. May I?" "By all means, impress me with your rice cooker diplomacy." Sebastian studied it for a moment, pressed a small unmarked button on the side, and the lid released with an unassuming click. Elliot stared at him. There was a button. There was a button. "You didn't even look at the manual." "I didn't need to. It's the same mechanism as the one in the Providence condo." Sebastian couldn't quite keep the corner of his mouth from twitching. "I've become, against every expectation I had for my own life, extremely competent with a rice cooker." "I hate that this is attractive to me," Elliot muttered, mostly to himself, and then flushed, actually flushed. Color climbing his throat when he realized he'd said it out loud, and Sebastian, watching him with an expression gone suddenly warm and a little stunned, didn't say anything at all, just let the silence sit there between them, charged and unhurried, the first genuinely easy silence they'd shared in weeks. They spent that day walking down through Higashiyama's stone lanes, with Milo strapped to Sebastian's chest, in a carrier Elliot had bought in a panic during week 2, and never quite mastered the buckles on, past shop fronts, selling matcha and folding fans, up toward a temple gate where a monk rang a bell so large it seemed to vibrate in Elliot's sternum. Sebastian bought Milo a small carved wooden fox from a shop near Kiyomizu-dera, solemnly explained to their 6-month-old son that it was a kitsune, a messenger spirit, in the exact tone he probably used to close 9-figure shipping contracts, and Elliot had to look away toward the maple trees so Sebastian wouldn't see him smile too hard at it. "You're very serious about mythology for a man who alphabetizes paprika," Elliot said. "I contain multitudes. You contain spreadsheets." "The spreadsheets are the multitudes, Elliot. That's the tragedy of my whole personality." And there it was again, dry, unexpected, a joke landing soft in the space between them, and Elliot laughed loud enough that a passing group of tourists turned to look, and did not for once feel embarrassed about it. That night, after Milo was asleep, and the lanterns along the lane outside had come on gold, and warm through the paper screens, they sat on the narrow engawa overlooking a postage stamp garden, close enough that their knees touched, and didn't talk for a long while. "I'm not asking you to say anything's fixed," Sebastian said eventually, quiet, watching the small stone lantern in the garden rather than Elliot's face, which Elliot understood, somehow, as its own kind of gift, the space to not be looked at while something honest got said. "I flew here because I missed my son so badly it felt like a physical injury, and because I missed you in a way I don't think I let myself feel the first 3 years we were married, and I didn't want to go one more week without you knowing that, whatever you decide to do with it." Elliot looked at the lantern too. "It felt easier that way. I don't know what I'm deciding yet," he admitted. "I know I'm not ready to go back to how it was. I know," he stopped, started again. "I know I like the rice cooker version of you a lot more than I expected to." Sebastian's laugh, when it came, was low and a little rough, like something surprised out of him. "That's a start." "It's a start," Elliot agreed, and let his knee stay exactly where it was, pressed warm against Sebastian's, and neither of them moved it for a long, long time. Sebastian flew back to Providence 2 days later. He didn't ask to extend the trip. He didn't push for more than what he'd been given. But at the gate, duffel bag over one shoulder, he pressed a kiss to the top of Milo's head, and then slower, asking permission with his eyes before he did it to Elliot's temple, just for a second. Just enough to leave warmth behind after he'd gone. "Ask me again Friday," Elliot said, without quite meaning to, echoing words neither of them had said yet in this life, but that somehow already felt like a promise waiting to happen. Sebastian went still. "What?" "Nothing." Elliot flushed again, waved him towards security. "Go. You'll miss your flight. Text me when you land." "I always text when I land." "I know," Elliot said, softer than he meant to, and watched him go, and didn't stop smiling about it for the rest of the day no matter how hard he tried. Marcus Hayes built his entire plan on one assumption, that Sebastian, cut off from his husband and convinced his marriage was already lost, would come apart at the seams within a month, reckless, distracted, easy to maneuver into a mistake big enough to justify the family council removing him. What he had not accounted for was that Sebastian Hayes, 31 years old, heir to an empire built on other people's fear, had spent the last 6 weeks becoming, for the first time in his adult life, almost boringly stable. He answered every call from Kyoto within one ring. He ran the Providence operation with a cold, methodical patience that unnerved his own men more than his temper ever had. He stopped drinking past one glass. He actually read, cover to cover 3 books on infant sleep training that Benny had mockingly recommended, purely so that when Milo eventually came home he'd know what he was doing. He was, in short, doing the work. Quietly, without an audience, with no guarantee it would earn him anything at all. It was Camille who finally caught Marcus in the act, an intercepted transfer, an offshore account with his name buried 3 shell companies deep, a paper trail leading straight back to the photographer, the rooftop meeting, and a man in the alley near the Brooklyn docks who, once caught, was extremely eager to talk in exchange for a lighter sentence. The family council convened on a rain-soaked Tuesday in a Back Bay boardroom that smelled like old money and older secrets, dark wood, cigar smoke that had soaked into the walls decades before anyone in the room had been born, a long table surrounded by men who had spent their entire lives learning to let silence do their talking for them. New character, Marcus Hayes, 61, Sebastian's uncle, the family's longtime consigliere, a man whose smile had closed more deals than anyone else's threats right up until the moment it stopped working. Marcus arrived 12 minutes late, unbothered, already reaching for the seat at Sebastian's right hand, out of 30 years of habit. And it was that habit, more than anything, that told Sebastian his uncle genuinely believed he'd gotten away with it. "Nephew," Marcus said, settling in, folding his hands. "I hear congratulations are in order. Family reunited. Very touching. Sit down, Marcus," Sebastian said. And something in his voice made the room go quiet in a way it hadn't for the 20 minutes of throat-clearing small talk that preceded it. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing about Sebastian Hayes that unnerved people more than shouting ever could, the way his calm only ever got colder, never louder, the closer he was to something that mattered. He laid it out piece by piece, unhurried, the way you'd set a table for a meal everyone at it already knew wasn't going to be pleasant. The offshore account, the shell companies, the photographer's invoice, paid from an account with Marcus's late wife's maiden name on it, a detail Marcus's own carelessness had left exposed. The man from the alley near the docks, now cooperating fully, whose signed statement sat in a folder Sebastian slid, unopened, into the center of the table like a closing argument. "You had my husband followed. You staged a photograph specifically designed to make him believe I'd betrayed him. And you did it because you calculated, correctly, that a marriage falling apart would make me distracted enough to make a mistake you could use against me." Sebastian's voice never wavered. "Then, when that wasn't fast enough for you, you ordered a hit on my husband and my son. Your own great-nephew, Marcus, the last of our blood you'll ever get close enough to touch." The room had gone entirely silent by then. 12 men who had built careers on never showing their hand, watching Marcus Hayes' face for the first crack in 30 years of composure, and it came, finally, not as an apology, but as contempt, thin and undisguised. "You were never going to be strong enough to hold this family together," Marcus said, "not distracted by a husband. Not soft the way you've gone soft this last year." "Maybe," Sebastian said. "But I'm strong enough to make sure you never get the chance to find out." He nodded once, to the 2 men by the door, and that was the entirety of it. No raised voice, no theater, just a decision already made and quietly, completely enforced. Marcus Hayes was removed within the hour, arrested within the week on charges attempted murder, extortion, wire fraud that would keep him occupied for the remainder of his natural life. Sebastian called Kyoto the moment it was done. It was 4 a.m. there. Elliot picked up on the second ring because he'd been awake, because he'd apparently stopped being able to sleep well without the low rumble of Sebastian's voice somewhere in his day. "It's over," Sebastian said. "He's gone. You and Milo can come home whenever you're ready. No pressure. I needed you to hear it from me first." Elliot sat in the dark of the Machia, Milo asleep in the next room, wisteria shadows moving on the ceiling, and felt something in his chest finally, quietly unclench. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we'll come home." Sebastian didn't come to the airport. Elliot noticed it the moment he cleared customs at JFK, scanning the crowd out of habit before he could stop himself, and felt a small, unreasonable drop of disappointment low in his stomach before he caught himself and remembered he's giving you space. Idiot, this is what you asked for. It was Benny waiting instead, holding a hand-lettered sign that said, "Welcome home," traders in enormous block letters, which made Elliot laugh so hard in the middle of the arrivals hall that a stranger asked if he was all right. He wanted to come, Benny said, taking Milo's diaper bag without being asked, falling into step beside Elliot toward the taxi line. I told him not to. I said if the first thing this kid sees after 14 hours of travel is his dad crying in an airport, that's a whole therapy bill I'm not footing. He wasn't going to cry. Elliot. He has cried in front of me twice this month, and I only see him for handoffs. Benny gave him a sideways look, not unkind. You gonna be okay seeing him tonight? Elliot thought about a rice cooker with a hidden button, and a stone lantern in a garden, and a kiss pressed to his temple like a question he hadn't answered yet. Yeah, he said, surprising himself with how certain it came out. Yeah, I think I will. Sebastian was waiting at the apartment instead, not inside, because he no longer had a key to a place that wasn't his anymore, and hadn't asked for one, but sitting on the front stoop in the cold with a grocery bag beside him, the same charcoal coat, the same careful 2 feet of distance the moment he stood. I made soup, he said, a little helplessly, holding up the bag like evidence. I don't actually know if it's good, your mother-in-law's recipe. I called her for it, which she found extremely funny, and I would like it on the record that I did not appreciate being laughed at for 45 straight minutes. You called your mother for a soup recipe. I called your mother-in-law, which happens to also be my mother, for a soup recipe, yes. He shifted his weight, and for a man who had once dismantled 4 armed attackers without breaking a sweat, he looked, standing on that stoop with a grocery bag of homemade soup, almost unbearably young. I wanted you to come home to something warm. I know that's small. I know soup doesn't undo 3 years. I wanted to try. Elliot looked at him for a long moment. Milo asleep and warm against his shoulder, jet-lagged and raw and unexpectedly close to tears in a way he hadn't braced for. Come inside, he said. Tell me if it's actually good, or if I need to lie to you about it. It was, in fact, good a little too much time, which Elliot pointed out with vicious satisfaction, but good, and they ate it standing at the kitchen counter at 11 p.m., like 2 people relearning an old language, and when Sebastian finally left near midnight, he didn't ask for anything. Not a kiss, not a promise, not a date on the calendar. At the door, though, Elliot caught his sleeve. Friday, he said. Sebastian turned back, something careful and hopeful moving across his face all at once. Friday what? You asked me to have dinner with you, back before all of this. I never gave you an answer. Elliot's mouth curved, small and a little shy, a shadow of the reckless grin Dorian Vance used to wear like a birthright, now worn softer, more deliberate, entirely his own. Friday, pick somewhere good. I've had enough soup for 1 week. Sebastian's laugh, when it broke loose, was the most unguarded sound Elliot had ever heard him make. Friday, he agreed, and walked out into the cold like a man who'd just been handed something he'd stopped letting himself hope for. 6 months later, Elliot's apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Fort Greene, chosen deliberately far from any Hayes property, because some independence he'd earned the hard way and had no intention of giving back, smelled like coffee and baby soap, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs only to people who chose their own peace on purpose. Milo, 1-year-old now, sat on the living room floor, batting at a stuffed elephant Benny had shipped from a Kyoto souvenir shop, making the gurgling laugh that did something permanent to Elliot's chest every single time he heard it. Round-cheeked, bright-eyed, and so relentlessly, ordinarily alive, that some mornings Elliot just sat and watched him and thought about that alley by the docks and could not believe how far they'd come from it. His laptop sat open on the counter, 43 students waiting on today's literature lecture, because Elliot Parker, it turned out, taught undergraduate English at Brooklyn College 3 days a week, and Dorian Vance, who had never finished a single book in his old life on purpose, had discovered somewhere in the last year that he genuinely loved it. Notes on Fitzgerald. On the space between what people say and what they mean. On how the most important things in any story are always the things left unwritten. His students thought he was talking about The Great Gatsby. He was always talking about The Great Gatsby. He didn't think about Marcus Hayes anymore. The man didn't deserve the space. Sebastian, though Sebastian was a different conversation entirely, he showed up every single time. That was the thing Elliot kept coming back to, turning over in his hands like a stone worn smooth. Every custody handoff, every scheduled visit, he was early, never late, never once canceled. He sat on the floor and played with Milo for hours, and never once made a performance of it. For Elliot's benefit, he was just there, fully, in a way he'd never managed to be in the first 3 years of a marriage Elliot hadn't even chosen to walk into. He brought food when he dropped Milo off. Never asked if Elliot needed it, just left it on the counter, the good bagels, from the place on Court Street. Elliot's coffee order exactly right down to the extra shot. Small things Elliot had never once told him he noticed, and that Sebastian, apparently, had been quietly cataloging the entire time. They'd had dinner every Friday since that first one, sometimes somewhere absurdly nice. A corner table at a restaurant in Tribeca, where Sebastian apparently still had enough standing to get a reservation on 20 minutes' notice. More often somewhere ordinary, a diner 2 blocks from Elliot's apartment, with vinyl booths and coffee, that tasted faintly of the pot it had been sitting in too long, because Elliot had confessed, 3 weeks in, that he actually preferred those, and Sebastian had never once suggested the nice restaurant again. They still teased each other, mercilessly, the way they'd learned to somewhere between a burnt lasagna and a rice cooker with a hidden button. Elliot had taken to sending him unsolicited photo evidence whenever he caught Sebastian's alphabetized spice rack out of order at the old penthouse. Found this abomination. Thought you'd want to know your empire is crumbling from the inside. And Sebastian had responded, once, with a photograph of his own immaculately organized sock drawer captioned, "This is who you're dealing with. Adjust your expectations accordingly," which had made Elliot laugh so hard in the middle of grading papers that a student had knocked on his office door to check if he was all right. There had been one real fight, back in month 3, about Sebastian missing a pediatrician appointment for a call he swore was unmissable, about old patterns creeping back and disguised as new circumstances, and Elliot had braced. That old familiar dread coiling low in his stomach, for the silence that used to follow, the week of cold distance that used to be how Sebastian apologized without actually apologizing. Instead, Sebastian had shown up at the bakery 40 minutes later, mid-lunch rush, in front of God and Benny and half of Park Slope, and said, "You were right, and I was wrong. And I'm not going to let this become the kind of thing we don't talk about until it becomes 10 things we don't talk about." Loudly enough that a woman waiting for a croissant had actually applauded, and Elliot had laughed and cried at the same time, and made Sebastian buy the entire bakery line free coffee as penance, which Sebastian had done without complaint, and Elliot suspected no small amount of relief. Elliot had gone to therapy. He was still going. He was learning the difference between what he'd deserved and what he'd accepted, and some days that distinction felt like the single most important thing he'd ever studied in either life. He was happy, genuinely, actually happy, not the quiet survival he'd mistaken for happiness for the first stretch of this borrowed life, real happiness, the kind that belonged entirely to him. Tonight Sebastian stood at his door after the handoff, Milo already down for his nap in the next room, and looked at Elliot with the expression he'd been wearing for 6 months straight, patient, steady, not pushing. "Have dinner with me," he said quietly. Elliot looked at him for a long moment, this impossible, infuriating, thoroughly changed man, standing at the door of the life Elliot had rebuilt without him. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. "Ask me again Friday," he said instead, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it as an invitation. Sebastian's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a real smile Elliot had gotten out of him in months. Friday, Elliot agreed, and shut the door on the sound of Sebastian Hayes, heir to an empire, laughing quietly to himself on the other side of it. 2 years later, no pregnancies, no secret heirs, no assassination attempts, just 2 men, one increasingly opinionated toddler, and a kitchen that has survived far more than it should have. The thing nobody warns you about, Elliot thinks, standing in the doorway of the Fort Greene brownstone they bought together 18 months ago, after Friday and Tuesday dinner became, "Why do you still have a separate apartment, Elliot?" Be serious is that the terrifying part of loving someone was never the falling. It's the staying, on a random Tuesday, when the smoke alarm is going off and neither of them can find where they put the fire extinguisher. "It's fine," Sebastian says, waving a dish towel at the oven like that will help. "Sebastian, it is not fine. There are flames. There's a little smoke. That is not smoke, that is a war crime." Elliot grabs the extinguisher from exactly where it's always been, behind the recycling, because Sebastian insists that's logical, and it has never once been logical, and puts out what was, in fairness, a fairly ambitious attempt at a lasagna. Sebastian Hayes can dismantle a criminal empire, negotiate a shipping contract in 3 languages, and once talked a hostile board of directors into unanimous surrender using nothing but a raised eyebrow. He cannot, under any circumstances, be trusted alone with an oven. In my defense, Sebastian says, surveying the wreckage with the wounded dignity of a man who has genuinely tried his best, the recipe did not specify the foil would also become flammable. The recipe did not specify that because foil is not, generally, flammable, Sebastian. It is if you leave it on broil for 40 minutes. Why would you leave anything on broil for 40 minutes? I was on a call. With whom? The fire department, requesting an early appointment? From the living room, 3-year-old Milo appears in the doorway in dinosaur pajamas, takes one look at the smoke-hazed kitchen, and delivers his verdict with the flat, devastating honesty only small children possess. Papa broke dinner again. Thank you. Milo, Elliot says. Traitor, Sebastian mutters, scooping his son up anyway, pressing a kiss to his hair, entirely unbothered by the betrayal. We're getting pizza. Don't tell your dad I said the lasagna was salvageable, because it was extremely salvageable and he's being dramatic. It is ash, Sebastian. It has character. 20 minutes later, they're on the living room floor, with a pizza box between them. Milo narrating an elaborate dinosaur civil war across the coffee table, with the seriousness of a man delivering a State of the Union, and Sebastian's arm is slung along the back of the couch, behind Elliot's shoulders in the loose, unthinking way it does now. Easy in a manner that used to make Elliot's chest ache, with how badly he'd wanted it, and how long he'd had to wait. You know, Elliot says, watching him, for a man who once took out 4 armed men in 90 seconds flat without blinking, you are astonishingly bad at pasta. I have many talents. Cooking is not required to be among them. I married a professional. Sebastian tips his head, considering. You could teach me. I have tried 3 times. You set a timer on fire once. That was character building. It was a hazard. Character building hazard. Sebastian corrects, entirely serious, and Elliot laughs so hard he has to set his pizza down, and Sebastian watches him do it with the same expression he's worn for 2 straight years now, not the careful, patient waiting from before, but something looser, something that has clearly, finally, stopped bracing for the door to shut. Later, after Milo's asleep and the dinosaurs have been declared a ceasefire, they end up on the back steps under the kind of clear October sky New York rarely bothers to offer, Sebastian's shoulder warm against his, a blanket dragged out from the hall closet thrown over both their knees. I keep waiting for it to feel normal, Elliot admits quiet. This, us. I keep bracing for the part where it goes back to how it was. Sebastian is quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to terrify Elliot, and now just means he's choosing his words carefully, the way he does with things that matter. It won't, he says finally. Not because I'm perfect. I set a timer on fire 2 hours ago. Elliot snorts. But because I know now what it costs to lose you, and I am never again going to be the kind of man who thinks a phone call can wait. You taught me that, the hard way. I'd rather have learned it easy, but I'll take it either way I got it. Elliot leans his head against his shoulder, and Sebastian's arm tightens around him, and for a long moment neither of them says anything else. Because there's nothing else that needs saying, just 2 men on a back porch, with a burnt lasagna cooling in a trash can, and a 3-year-old dictator asleep upstairs, and an entire, ordinary, unhaunted future stretched out in front of them like a street, with no one lying in wait at either end of it. Marry me again, Sebastian says suddenly, apropos of absolutely nothing. Elliot lifts his head. We're already married, I know. I want to do it again. Properly this time. Somewhere you actually chose. I want, he stops. And for the first time in 2 years, Elliot watches Sebastian Hayes actually fumble for words. I want a version of that day that you'll want to remember. Elliot looks at him for a long moment, this ridiculous, reformed, spectacularly incompetent at lasagna man, who once turned his whole body into a shield without a second's hesitation, who learned to read baby books and answer every call and stand quietly at a door for 6 months without ever once demanding to be let back in before he was ready. Okay, he says, and kisses him before Sebastian can say anything else devastatingly sincere and ruin his own composure completely. But I'm picking the caterer. Last time your family's guy served salmon at an Irish-Italian wedding, and nobody has ever forgiven him. That's fair, Sebastian says against his mouth, laughing, and somewhere above them a street lamp flickers on. and somewhere upstairs their son sleeps through the whole quiet, ordinary miracle of it: two men, one very fireproof future, and a lasagna pan that would need to be thrown directly in the trash. If this story stayed with you, don't scroll past it in silence. Tell us down in the comments which moment hit you hardest. We genuinely read every single one. A like and a subscribe helps us keep telling stories like this, so more of them can find their way to you. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.